Why the Ents in Lord of the Rings don't ruin the willing suspension of disbelief. Think about it. Are they flora or fauna? Where are their brains? I never stopped to consider. Lord of the Rings is a fantasy, but think about the characters. Men, dwarves, hobbits, elves. They're all primates. I think 2 arms, 2 legs, opposable thumbs, basically a man, but in different shapes. We start to stretch things a bit with intelligent eagles, but I sort of understand that a giant bird would have a giant brain. At least the raw material is there. I mean, small brain or large brain, there's a neural network there. Blood carries oxygen in and waste out. The structure's in place for cognition to occur. Smart critters are sentient and sapient, while more simple creatures, like bumblebees, are intelligent enough to run a program but not self-aware. What would a bumblebee dream about? I don't know. Probably frightening children while simultaneously looking adorable. So Lord of the Rings is set in fantasy, but it's not that far out in terms of fantasy. There's a spectrum of fantasy realms. On one end is a world that isn't too fantastic. It's mostly sword and very little sorcery. On the other end, you have a world with more non-human creatures, some that defy the laws of physics. For example, an intelligent talking dragon. Is it possible? Could something like a T-Rex have a large enough brain to allow speech? Sure. It's not likely, but it's possible. It's within the realm of possibility. But a flying dragon? No, that just can't happen. The power to mass levels are wrong. There were pterodactyls and giant birds of the Pleistocene, but they weren't very big, less than 200 kilograms. So I have to assume 200 kilograms is the upper limit. Dragons in fantasy are portrayed as, 2,000 kilograms, so that we know they aren't going to be flying anywhere. There would have to be some serious chemistry going on to allow muscles to contract fast enough to lift a 2,000 kilogram dragon. You would still need to get rid of waste byproducts. The heat generated would be intense. A large flying dragon would be glowing in the dark with the heat output. Or take something like a centaur, the upper body of a human on the lower body of a horse. How does a human mouth eat enough food to fuel the mass of the horse? It's impossible. And when you see characters like that, you know that you are on the more extreme side of fantasy. The more fantastic fantasy stories will focus on wizards firing lightning at each other and a spell for every occasion. But it's hard to write heavy magic stories because it's too easy to use magic to save your characters when you write them into a corner. It's hard for the reader to understand magic. Terry Pratchett writes a magic universe very well because the magic is kept to a minimum. The ridiculous characters and funny situations drive the story. The story is set in a silly magic world, but the magic is kept in the background. Even in Piers Anthony's books, magic has strict rules and limitations. The flora and fauna is magical, but they obey the rules of Xanth. The books are fun, but they aren't great. It's really lightweight, formulaic fiction. It won't stand the test of time. Also, the author had a habit of making teenage girls the sexy characters, basically 16-year-old sexpots. Believe it or not, in the 80s and 90s, that was mostly cool. It's still cool in most countries, but the U.S. is oddly puritanical about sex for some reason. In current age, a Piers Anthony book could never get made into a movie. The SJW Puritans would lose their minds. Pratchett and Anthony still managed to write a very good and successful books, but in fantasy, there's a lot of bad fantasy books out there. Bad fantasy books have a tendency to be very overwritten. When you pick up a fantasy book, you will strain. They are 500 pages in small font. The Wheel of Time series is a telephone book. Usually in a story, it's tricky to introduce the more fantastic elements in the middle of the story. It feels like God in the Machine. That's a good image. It's not, but it can feel like the rules for the story's universe are being violated a little bit. In something like the Xanth or Discworld books, the outrageous characters are right in your face right from the start. The Discworld stories start with an explanation that the world is a disc resting on the back of 4 elephants resting on a turtle that swims through space. But no matter how far out the story's universe is, the world needs to obey the internal rules of its universe. You can't have a character reach up and grab the sun out of the sky and throw it at someone. It would take the reader out of the fantasy world immediately. It's why The Last Jedi was a failure. When Admiral Gender Studies rammed her spaceship into the bad guys at light speed, it destroyed the willing suspension of disbelief immediately. It begs the question, why haven't both sides been using faster-than-light missiles this whole time? Why did Admiral Blue Hair Manhater have to stay aboard the ship? There are droids in the Star Wars universe. Have them fly the ship, or remote pilot the ship from the safety of another ship. There's no logical way to defend this. Even the SJWs admit this, but they say, oh well, it's for kids, it's about space wizards. But then, why doesn't someone grab the sun out of the sky and throw it? Because it's ridiculous. But so is Admiral Panties in a Wad using her lightspeed trick. Either it's allowed, and for some reason no one has thought to make hyperlight missiles, or it's not allowed, and it's an example of the worst writing possible. For those of you who remember physics, mass times velocity squared equals the energy of impact, approximately. This means a very small object at light speed would destroy a starship. You don't need a ship-sized object. You could fire a baseball at a ship's engines at light speed, and it would blow it sky high. If you're curious, you could do the math for take a gram or of say 10 grams of a lead-sized bullet at I don't know what they fire out of a 250 meters per second, and then square it, multiply it, and that would give you an approximate energy for, say, a handgun, and then scale it up for a baseball-sized mass at the speed of light. And once you start squaring the speed of light, you get very, very large numbers. Anyway, The Last Jedi had some other issues as well, but the light speed trick was one of the silliest ones. The whole treatment of Holdo and Leia towards their subordinates was insanely bad. Military officers don't treat their subordinates like children. When we see a scene like that, it violates common sense. Holdo and Leia don't act like people you would follow into battle. They act like feminists who are incompetent to lead. So why did the Ents work? I think because they weren't silly. Their environment is dark and foreboding. Treebeard is a serious, wise, venerable old character. The feeling is, yeah, you have these trees that can live 1,000 years. They would speak slowly. They have so much accumulated knowledge. They would have a lot of time to sit and think. Maybe they were active in the early days, but over the past 100 years, they have slowed down a bit. The Ents are not cartoons. They are very serious. The idea of a thinking plant is pretty silly, but the storyline of the Ents is so interesting, so deeply mysterious that we never slow down enough to wonder about the plausibility of talking trees. The more we like the characters, the more we are willing to overlook. Holdo and Leia are deeply unlikable characters. The viewer didn't accept that they were leadership material. They didn't have the confidence of command. They acted like grandmothers with a chip on their shoulder. We know they didn't get there on merit. They got there as diversity hires. The more screen time they have, the more the viewer is taken out of the film. We know that these women aren't leaders. They just don't look like soldiers. My point is that when we see Leia and Holdo in these roles, the movie starts to fall apart. When Holdo used the lightspeed trick, the viewer is so shocked by the stupidity of this bad writing that the willing suspension of disbelief is destroyed. The viewer realizes he has wasted 2 hours on this feminist propaganda. But the Ents don't destroy the willing suspension of disbelief. Partially, to be fair, because we read about it in the book, so we know it was coming. And if anything, in the book, the Ents are a little more sinister. So, partially the reason the Ents work is because they are dark, sinister characters, not Smurfs. I was going to say Ewoks, but people seem to forget that the Ewoks were going to eat the heroes in Return of the Jedi. Which reminds me that Luke had to concentrate to levitate C-3PO so he could convince the Ewoks that he was a god. Remember in The Last Jedi how Rey raised thousands of pounds of rocks? That is a Mary Sue. But the film was so bad by that point that it didn't matter. Luke wasn't a Mary Sue. He had a lot of failures and he had to struggle. Anakin in the prequels, you could argue, was a Mary Sue, but the character was mostly likable, and the movies were fun and positively received when it came out. When the prequels came out, the fans who saw them in the theater were totally behind the films. It's only when later viewers watched the films in their living room that they realized how slow the romantic scenes were between Anakin and Padme. Both are good actors, but the dialogue must be written to the actor's ability to deliver the lines. If the actors aren't selling the dialogue, then you need to rewrite the dialogue overnight or simply cut the scenes. You could have cut the romance scenes and just implied, with quick, flirtatious glances, that a romance was developing. You could easily cut the political scenes that show the Congress. It was pure green screen and it was boring. Remember Jar Jar? Most of the prequels were green screen, but some scenes work better than others. Lord of the Rings was also green screen, but it was better quality green screen. Anyway, Anakin was probably a Mary Sue, but the movie took you on a fun ride that was fast enough not to let the viewer stop and think about Mary Sues and plot holes. The prequels also had many strong characters, while the Disney Soy Wars didn't. The guys in the Disney films were short on purpose. They wanted them more on equal footing with the female characters. Tall men are too masculine. But I keep digressing into the cancer that is The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi. The Ents in The Lord of the Rings worked for many reasons. The films themselves were masterpieces because the source material was a work of genius. The writers and directors of The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi may have had talent, but their goal wasn't to make the best film possible. Their goal was to write crude feminist propaganda and subvert expectations. First of all, it's time to forget about writing feminist propaganda. It's cringe. It's hard enough to write a great, successful story without propaganda. And as for subverting expectations, perhaps a master storyteller can pull it off. But Disney, Abrams, and Roundhead are not master storytellers. Disney has a string of successful formulaic films, but when they started pushing propaganda, the sales started to slip. The Force Awakens did about $2 billion. The Last Jedi made less, and Solo lost $80 million. The Last Jedi should have made even more than The Force Awakens, and the fact that it didn't should be seen as a failure and a huge warning to Disney. Disney ignored the warning signs and made Solo a Soy Wars story. The soybean that broke the camel's back was when someone at Disney said Lando was gay. This was a needle scratch on the record moment. Earmuffs. They made Lando a cocksucker. You can't do that to Lando and expect to sell tickets. Most fans aren't Tumblrites. Now here's the thing. Due to political correctness, the higher-ups couldn't correct the rumor without being called homophobic. It's like a weird politically correct death spiral, and as a consequence, the film lost money. But I keep digressing. The Disney Star Wars is like a black hole of suckiness. A film like Lord of the Rings can get away with a lot of things simply because it was written by a master storyteller, Tolkien, and made into film by Peter Jackson, another master storyteller. Kathleen Kennedy is responsible for Soy Wars. I'm pretty sure she ate lead paint chips as a child, and for some strange reason, after Solo lost $80 million, she wasn't fired. I don't quite understand the logic behind keeping her on. The problem is that Disney is mediocre, but they think they are good. They have delusions of adequacy. Or rather, they would be good if they focused on telling the best stories they could and left the feminist propaganda on the cutting room floor. Another reason the Ents worked is because Tolkien did something very weird when he introduced the Ents. He included the subplot of the Ent wives. Now, this could have been sort of a throwaway plot or a facet of the story that was simply included to flesh the characters out a bit. It worked very well. It grabbed the reader's attention and told them that there's a mystery here. No matter the resolution of this story of the Ring, there could be a prequel story explaining the history of the Antwives, and then a story post-Return of the King that explores the mystery further. You run into problems when you have a story about non-human characters. It's hard for the reader to identify with ambulatory trees, but it doesn't matter if there ever was a conclusion to the mystery of the Antwives. It has drawn the reader further into the story. It added depth to these characters. For me, it was one of the high points of the story, especially when the Ents somewhat broke character when they were roused to battle. The story sort of led you to believe that the Ents were going to spend too much time talking about what should be done and be too late to get into the fight. It throws the reader off balance a bit when you see how powerful and effective they were. The Ents remind me, they seem to work as an analogy for the UK post-World War II. The UK seems to forget its powerful past. They've gone to sleep and are letting foreigners take over the once mighty England. The analogy reminds me that, like the Ents, the English people aren't having children, though I don't know if the Ents ever had grooming gangs. Perhaps when in a few years the UK has a civil war with the left and Islam, it will be like the Ents' last battle before going to sleep and getting tree-ish. I assume history will follow due course and Western Europe will be in World War III in a few years. Maybe the English, i.e. the Ents, will jump in to save the day. I know that most folks won't make it to the end of the video, so I can include some of the further out theories. You know, it's funny because Tolkien said he didn't like analogy, but his works weren't created in a vacuum, and we the readers are free to make comparisons. Indiecron, the Comicsgate hub. Let's take a look, see what's going on. Lone Star Soul of the Soldier, $94,000. Congratulations, Indiecron. Adam Fist, The Wraith, Mike Family, some of these I've never heard of. Lone Star Soul the Soldier, well, I think he's doing just fine. We don't have to worry about him. All right, let's take a look at Bloodhunt graphic novel. It says it... Well, that looks pretty good. It kind of reminds me of the 1999, I think, album by Korn, Follow the Leader, a little bit. No, just me. Campaign, horror and supernatural. John Wick was an action horror comic mixed with the darkness and the Hellsing Ultimate Anime. You get Bloodhunt. Let's take a look at what we have. Nice. Where's the dialogue? Alright, everything looks good. A little Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde type of thing. I wonder if it's supposed to be in black and white or if they're going to color it. Everything looks okay. Some of the stuff looks better than okay. Not bad. Let's take a look at something else. Okay, I clicked on this one at kind of a random. The Art of Vinnie Tartamella. That kind of looks like it's supposed to be going for a Harley Quinn type of theme. Looks good to me. Let's see, campaign details. What's the genre? Oh, it's an art book. It's not a story. Okay, well, I mean, the art looks good, but I'm going to have to pass on that because I'm not into the strictly art books. I like a good story. Okay, I grabbed another one that looked kind of interesting to me. The Elemental Balance, Chapter 4, Fired Up. Written by Zane Shenwari. Art by Luke Horseman. Okay, looks like a highly stylized style. I like that. Somewhere in Chile. I like that composition. The different colors kind of. I mean, it's a tropical scene, and you really believe it. It's like you can kind of feel it, and you can feel that scene too. So highly stylized human figures. That's okay. If it works, it seems to work pretty well. It looks like that chick from Star Trek with the, Return of the Jedi, the dancing girls. I wish there was dialogue, but this all looks pretty good. Except I don't know what's going on. Visiting a volcano. Okay, only a few pages. Anyway, it looks good. I thought I would take a look at some of the stuff from Indiegogo, or Indiecron, the Comicsgate stuff that shows the Comicsgate Indiegogo books. Anyway, leave a like and a comment if you would, to help the algorithm. Congratulations to the Littlest Umbrella. That is amazing. I hope he hits $100,000. The book looks good, and Tug is a class act. Anyway, thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed it.